Just a couple of items to talk about beforehand. First of all, my name is Rachel Moreau. I am Vice President of the Historic Murray First Foundation, sponsoring this. We have a book giveaway. It's the book by our board historian Coral Broshinsky, and that she wrote about Murray. Is it the Images of America?
The Images of America
series. And she signed it. So for those of you who had pre-registered, you're eligible to win this book, and we will announce the winner at the end. If you're not here in person, we will arrange to get that to you. Our president, Amy Thomas, will reach out to you if you are not in attendance. We also have a little flyer up here. If you feel so inclined to donate, we have a QR code that is attached to the flyer that you can scan, and it's not required, but is appreciated and helps us very much in our efforts to preserve Murray. I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the evening, Peter Goss. He is a director on our board. We're very fortunate to have had Peter with us since almost the beginning. He is a director, and he is has been very valuable and full of information for us. We have been very fortunate to have his help. He is a professor emeritus of architectural history at the University of Utah. He's taught the history of architecture in the College of Architecture and Planning and for the Division of Continuing Education at the U. He also is a co-author with Thomas Carter of the book Utah's Historic Architecture 1847 through 1940, a guide, and he's currently working on a book about Taylor Woolley. So we are super excited and lucky to have our resident expert giving us this talk on Taylor Woolley tonight, and we appreciate Peter and everything that he brings to the board. Just as a final note, if there are questions, and if we make it to 7:30 and there are questions that there have not been time for, Peter will meet you on the front porch of the library and we'll take questions there. And also our president, Amy, will be monitoring the Zoom chat for questions that come in. So we will make every attempt to get all of your questions answered. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Peter. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. It's nice to be here and see some friends and some new people. I was a stranger to Utah in 1970 when I started my first year at the university, and became very interested in the fact that there wasn't a lot of history written about architecture. And I'm an architectural historian, so I picked up on it. And I am delighted to have found Taylor Woolley, a Utah architect and an apprentice to Frank Lloyd Wright, who I knew Wright, and probably Wright is the person who got me interested in being an architectural historian when he was working on the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. My dad would bring home, I grew up on Long Island, my dad would bring home the newspaper with an article on it. And I kept reading and reading. And as soon as you could go there, my dad brought me there, and we had a good time. Taylor Alstrom Woolley, as you see here, was born in 1884 in Salt Lake City. He was a member of the large Woolley family whose compound of houses comprised most of the block bordered by 400 South and 300 East. He continued to live there after he graduated from LDS Business College. It was sometimes called LDS High School, but it focused on business. He graduated in 1902 from there, and he was interested in drawing and art. He forsook a business career to study architecture by way of a home correspondence class. And maybe some of you have heard of ICS, the International Correspondence School of Scranton, Pennsylvania. I think they're still in operation. And if you were wanting to be an architect, and many architects in the Utah area had no school to go to, so they studied at the ICS, and you had to be sending off your drawings, etc., to Scranton, Pennsylvania. And it was interesting because there were more ICS people than I think most firms knew about in order to get in the door. Since then, since there were no formal architectural schools, this is what was the form of education. And that was particularly true around the turn of the 20th century. He and his artist friend Waldo Midgley, who is here with Mahanrai McIntosh Young, also took drawing classes from the sculptor Mahanrai Young. In 1905, all three remained lifelong friends, and Young completed his art studies in Europe and had recently visited his friends Gertrude and Leo Stein at their summer house in Fiesole, Italy. Now, how did he get to know the Steins? They had a son who was in school with Taylor Woolley, and they obviously, I'm sure that the son invited him to the bookstore as well as the family outings. So about 1906, whoa, I didn't touch anything. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out. Yeah, okay. In about 1906, he became a draftsman for a large, Taylor Woolley, became a draftsman for the larger and more prolific Salt Lake firm of Ware and Draganza. The architectural designer in this partnership was a Californian by the name of Alberto Draganza, who was greatly influenced by the arts and crafts movement and also influenced by Prairie School architecture. In 1908, Woolley left Salt Lake City for Chicago and may have traveled with a fellow draftsman, Hiram Pope, of the firm of Pope and Burton, who also studied architecture through ICS. Pope landed a job with one of the large Chicago firms known for their skyscraper designs, and Woolley was hired by a Chicago architect by the name of Howard Van Doren Shaw. Shaw was sometimes called a society architect because of the expensive houses he designed for residents in north of Chicago, some of the suburbs north of Chicago, which had quite a bit of well-to-do people living in. Woolley's tenure at Shaw's office was short, for he was hired as a draftsman in Frank Lloyd Wright's studio in the suburb of Oak Park in 1909. This is a drawing that is of the studio, the house that Wright had lived in before he designed the studio, and you can see the floor plan here. Is the roof is on the top of, I've got a pointer. The roof of the house is right here. You can go there today and go through a tour of both the house and the studio, and it's quite interesting to see what it is like. That same year, he and Pope were taking evening art classes at the Chicago Art Institute to perfect their drawing skills. Shortly after Woolley joined Wright's studio, the master, Frank Lloyd Wright, this is a young picture of him, and his wife, Catherine Tobin Wright. His intention, I'm trying to find my place here. Shortly after Woolley joined Wright's studio, the master was in the midst of an affair with a client, Mama Borthwick Cheney. She was the wife of one of his, was a client with her husband. Wright designed the Cheney house, which we'll see coming up. Anyway, Wright, to assist him on the project, Wright invited his, well, I'm jumping around here. His intention was to work on a portfolio of his designs at the bequest of the Berlin publisher Ernst Wasmuth. And he invited his oldest son, Lloyd Wright, who became a well-known architect in California, to come with him. And he invited Woolley, who had been a draftsperson in his office, to go to Europe and begin to put together a series of what would become lithographs of his early work. He first landed in Florence, and then the town of Fiesole in the mountains above Florence is where they ended up. This is a view of Woolley's photograph of the Velino Belvedere. Velino is a separate house and sometimes on an estate with a villa. But the Velino was a small building. And here is Woolley outside the house. And I don't know whether that's Woolley in the corner bending over the drafting board, but you can see some of the images that they have produced and are stuck up on the wall here. The interesting thing is that Taylor Woolley had always had a camera with him. It was a Kodak 3x5 that you unfolded and took pictures of. I remember my father had one of these. And he took pictures all over Italy and all over when he was working with Wright. Woolley photographed the interior of the studio. In that studio, photographs of Wright's various projects into a uniform appearance resembling the unique style of Marion Monti. Marion Monti was a woman architect, one of the first women architects to graduate from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And she was a noted renderer and a former Wright studio architect. The drawings were the basis of 100 lithographic plates as the, and here is one of the plates, and it happens to be of the Mr. and Mrs. Shaney's office in the house in Oak Park, Illinois. It's an aerial view, but it is interesting because this was would be considered a prairie style house with the low hipped roof and the other qualities inside, the more open feeling than a Victorian house would have on the interior. Wright's various projects, some of the early women, I'm getting ahead of myself. The drawings are the basis of the 100 portfolio, but that meant that Woolley and Lloyd Wright and Frank Lloyd Wright were working on this to get a uniform style of the drawings. And we have Woolley's copy of the Wasmuth portfolio in the Marriott Library. And the drawings are about almost 2 feet by almost 3 feet in size. And they are like this. There's no coloring of the drawings. It's a black and only ink drawing. This is just a construction photograph at Taliesin, the new home and studio of Frank Lloyd Wright in 1911. And Woolley and a partner, I might just describe what Lloyd Wright, I interviewed Lloyd Wright, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright in California many years ago. And he described Woolley as a sensitive draftsman, a Mormon, M-O-R-M-A-N, and from Salt Lake City, though lame, was active, helpful, and a hard worker. Taylor had been injured in a carriage accident when he was a young boy, and the church wouldn't allow him to go on a mission because he'd have to use a cane to get around. And he was very unhappy about that, but he later became more religious, I think, as a result of it. He went on to say that Father Woolley and I traced with crow quill pens on tracing paper all of the drawings and matters he wished to have published. The only documentation of this event is this set of photographs that I showed you earlier in the previous slide. We can go back there. And by June of, the only documentation of this event is Wooley's photographs, and they appear in a number of books. There are 34 different books that are professional scholarly works that have the story of Woolley and Frank Lloyd Wright and Lloyd Wright in their, between their covers. Here is a photograph taken by probably one of the workmen. Woolley is standing with the paint can or a stain can in his hand, and the man next to him is Clifford Evans. Clifford Evans became his partner later in his life, and he ended up marrying Clifford Evans' sister, Dorrit. Now, before he, when he was still in Chicago, he designed this house, which still stands in Sugar House, and it is a pretty simple plan, as you can see. It has a basement, was later filled in, but kitchen, bedroom, living room, and den. And it has a flat roof, and it's not very tall ceiling in it. And then they worked on filling out the basement with various rooms as they had kids too. Woolley returned to Chicago and began working for Herman von Holst, the firm that took over Wright's practice while he was in Italy. In that office, he was under the direction of Marion Mahoney. It's spelled M-A-H-O-N-Y, but it's pronounced, according to all the experts, not Mahoney, but Mahoney. And before he left for Europe, Wright suggested that Van Holst, who was a well-known architect in Chicago, would take over his practice and hire Miss Mahoney to finish the number of Wright's incomplete commissions. While still in Europe, Wright kept in touch with Woolley regarding the Bosmouth publications that finally appeared in the year 1911. In one of his letters, Wright wrote in 1909, that same year that he and Pope were taking evening classes. Whoops, not on the right page. Wright and Woolley discussed the conditions of the sale and what the prices were going to be on the publication, the Bosmouth portfolio. The majority of the portfolio plates displayed what architectural historians would later label as prairie school style. That refers to a group of Midwestern architects whose designs were characterized by low-pitched roofs, horizontal forms, and open interiors. In 1911, Woolley became a registered architect in the state of Utah and opened an office in the Sharon Building in Salt Lake City. However, Wright requested his assistance at Spring Green, Wisconsin, where they were building, or mostly built now, the Taliesin East house. This is one of Woolley's friends. He had a lot of artist friends. One of his artist friends decided to do a caricature of Woolley and from the side. And this was hanging one day, and I noticed it in the Alta Club, and an architect had gotten this drawing and framed it, and it was a show, but this was the only one that had an architect in it. Now, Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Griffin in Australia in 1930. Wright's new home and studio for he now divorced. He did the new home and studio for himself and his lover, Mama Borthwick, who is now divorced. He again, here again, Woolley documents the this photo was taken of Woolley and his friend, brother-in-law, Clifford Evans. That was the other person in the construction photo. While Woolley was in the Midwest helping Wright at Taliesin and working for von Holst in Chicago, he also produced drawings of a small one-story prairie house, which we've looked at. This is the image of Walter Burley Griffin and his recent bride, Marion Money. She and he married. They had both worked in Wright's studio at different times, and sometimes of that was overlapping. The work that Marion and a lot of people that were young architects helped with was getting the drawings that Marion and Walter were doing for a competition for the capital of Canberra, a capital of Australia. And it is recorded that Marion had to keep nudging Walter to stop planning and get some drawings going, because she was the one who was going to execute the drawings. And then Woolley was pulled in to do it, but a lot of other young architects were pulled in because they had to make a deadline for the ship that left San Francisco to go to Canberra. And if you miss the ship, you miss the competition. Now, the history behind this this capital of drawings for the capital is interesting. But in 1913, Woolley was listed in the Lakeside Annual Directory of the City of Chicago as again working for the firm of von Holst and Fife. The big project in the office for 1913 was a residential commission for Mr. and Mrs. Henry Ford. The Fords wanted von Holst firm to design their new style of home, their new home in the style of Frank Lloyd Wright, and therefore a prairie style design, and stipulated that the three architects in the firm, Herman von Holst was the boss, Taylor Woolley was one of the people in the office, and Marion Money was also, Griffin was also there. The early choice of the drawing of Marion Money was going to be the house that the Fords would occupy. But in the interim of all this, and Woolley was at the site when the ground was broken and stayed overnight, had a place to live on the site on the river. There's a river in front of this house. When I went to the Ford Museum in Dearborn and did some research, they had just acquired this drawing, which was the color rendering that Woolley had submitted for the house. Now, they ended up choosing Marion Money's drawing, but they got interested in New England antique furniture. And they could see that this wasn't going to work in Marion's design. She had interior rooms, drawn out as well as plans. And so they ended up killing the commission. Well, Van Holst sued Ford and got a $10,000 payment out of that suit. So not all was lost, but it was maddening to the architectural firm, of course. When Wright needed a trustworthy architect or employee, he frequently picked on Woolley. And when Woolley was on the site in Dearborn in the early stages of the construction of the Ford house, he eventually the whole thing was stopped, and Van Holst spent over a year in the project, and that's why he had paid out a lot to the employees and sued. Woolley returned to Salt Lake City in 1914 and opened an office in the Felt building and continued to produce prairie-style residential designs for the Kimball and Richards firm of developers of Highland Park subdivision. At the end of March 1914, Wright wired Woolley to come to Taliesin and help him in the preparation of an exhibit of his work for the annual exhibition of the Chicago Architectural Club to be held at the Chicago Art Institute the following month. Woolley left for the Taliesin and worked on the exhibition. In particular, this is a puppet theater for children, and this was designed by Wright for his young children. Woolley once again photographed and the nearly completed theater in the living room of Taliesin. The big stone on the left-hand side is the lintel of the fireplace. So if you've been to Taliesin, you will notice that that is a major feature in the living room. Woolley once again photographed nearly completed the theater, which is here in the living room. And Wright had recovered his architectural reputation in spite of his early indiscretions, and more work was coming his way. He wanted Woolley to stay with him through the summer, but due to prior commitments, Woolley fortunately was unable to do so. On August 15th, 1914, a terrible tragedy occurred at Taliesin when a deranged servant set fire to Taliesin and then murdered May Machaney, her 2 children, and 4 others, including Emile Brodel. Emile Brodel was a 30-year-old draftsman that took Woolley's place. So Woolley was lucky it didn't go. In 1915, Woolley still had an office in the Felt building, and Clifford Evans may have managed that office while Woolley was in Chicago. During the same year, Woolley had designed several prairie-style homes to be built on Yale Avenue. One of the things that Woolley did during this period was get together with an architect by the name of Raymond Ashton, and they designed a subdivision for a portion of a sugar house. And this was to be the house of C.N. Stravell. Stravell was part owner of the Salt Lake Hardware Company. And I don't know what exactly happened, but whether he had a hard time acquiring land for this or not, but it never got built. But this was to be C.N. Stravell's house, and the name of the subdivision was St. Stravell, and it was 1914. In 1915, Woolley still had an office in the Felt building, and Clifford managed it. Woolley was in Chicago. During the same year, Woolley had designed several Prairie Styles homes on Yale Avenue. He did a lot of work in Utah while he was in Chicago and sent drawings back and forth. Ray was the most notable one is the William W. Ray residence. Ray was a Woodrow Wilson appointee to the U.S. Office of the Attorney General. The plan of this nearly square two-story house form is similar to a Frank Lloyd Wright house known as the Fireproof House of $5,000 that was exhibited in Ladies' Home Journal. Now, it's a simple, straightforward plan, as you can see. The upper three corners or four corners of the second floor are bedrooms, and there is a bathroom, and the master bedroom has a fireplace in it above the big fireplace in the living room. And the kitchen and dining room are basically in the same location as happened in the Ray house. This shows the living room and also emphasizes the arts and crafts quality of the design and finish to the rooms. The front door is, you can see it open on the side here, right there. There's a small pavilion outside, as you could see from the earlier slides. That was the office that the owner used for his home office. And this is the living room. The decor is oak, well, tiles above the fireplace, around the fireplace, and the rest of it is oak used in all of the woodwork that you see here. And then the two chandeliers were more of an influence of arts and crafts. The home has been continuously occupied since its completion in 1917. And Ray was one of the early purchases of the Vossmuth portfolio. There were about 20 copies sold to people in Utah and in the Intermountain West. Now, shortly after their return, I should start with the earlier paragraph. There was a period of time when Frank Lloyd Wright had gotten the commission to do the Imperial Hotel. And according to what I've researched, he was trying to ask Woolley to accompany him to be the architect on site. Woolley couldn't do that. After he had, shortly after one of the reasons why he couldn't do it is his wife was not in the best of health. Her name was Dorrit, and was homesick for her family and friends in Utah, and the couple returned to Salt Lake City. Shortly after their return, Woolley designed a residence for them, and this is their residence, and not a touch of Prairie style or arts and crafts. It's an English kind of cottage. And that's because by 1917, the Prairie style was no longer popular in the Midwest and particularly in Chicago. So, and what I think Woolley liked about it is he always liked landscape. And I have seen pictures of this house that is almost totally covered with vines and things. Now, to right here in town, the First National Bank of Murray, 1920-21. This is not Woolley's design. This is the Waverly building, which still stands. And the first office of the First National Bank, which was founded in 1908, was in the Waverly Building at one side. And later, the bank expanded to have the whole downstairs of that building. Now, the offices upstairs in these two-story buildings were like lawyers or doctors, that kind of thing. And that continues in here's a watercolor rendering by Woolley, by Woolley's office, and then the actual building completed. There was a lot of neoclassical architecture applied to bank buildings in the 20s. And some of it was way overdone. Here we only have a door that is emphasizing Corinthian or Doric columns, Ionic columns probably. And you see the ground floor is tall because of the size of the windows. And then up above is a doctor's office and two attorneys' offices. It's much simpler and plainer. And the bank was right on Main Street here. Unfortunately, it was torn down in the 70s. Here was the interior. The interior is very spacious and roomy looking. And that was not uncommon with banks at the time. Here in the branch, it became a branch bank of the Walker Bank. See the First Murray branch? There's a sign above the street light, or the light above the building that says Walker Bank on it, but you can't see it from the original photograph. But you can see the brickwork of the facade, which is very neat and done very carefully. And then also the very shallow depth of the limestone forming the base of the building. The window frames are also that way too. And that was deliberate because Woolley was not interested in creating a small temple from the classical Greek period. Instead, he wanted to have something that was plain and obvious for people to see. The first, in 1921, they were commissioned to build an apartment building in Salt Lake that eventually became named the Belvedere. Perhaps the name was offered by Woolley because of his association with the Velino Belvedere in Fiesole. The apartment building was planned to contain all the modern amenities of the period, including Murphy beds, electric ranges, automatic refrigeration, and telephones. And it has, and still stands, it has quite a few apartments in it. And this was built on a church property. The frame, the plan of the building is an H-shaped plan. And it is a concrete frame covered with brick veneer and also terracotta designs, decorative motifs around the entryways and the windows. The upper floors contained 18 apartments of between 2 and 7 rooms. That's on each floor, and there are 8 floors. Now, the second building that was a church, the church owned Social Hall Avenue, and they, I guess, sold the property to the automobile dealers that worked. And you've seen these, I don't know the exact date of when auto malls became popular, but I've seen them in San Francisco. I've seen them in various places. I've tried to look them up and to get more information, but it was early 20th century. And I'm kind of surprised that Salt Lake bought into one as early as 1922. But what you're seeing is just one side of Social Hall Avenue in this photograph. In the other photograph below, you can see that reinforced concrete is the framework of this building as well as the apartment building. And so you can see that they were able to make the columns standing quite far apart because of the strength of reinforced concrete. And there were a number of car dealerships on both sides of this street in Salt Lake. And by the 1980s, those concrete buildings were altered, and the office buildings have replaced most of them now. Upon the completion of the apartment building and automobile road, the architects chose to dissolve their partnership. They had a partnership with, when they knew they were going to settle back in Salt Lake, with an architect by the name of Miles Miller. And in 1922, the June issue of Architectural Forum magazine simultaneously announced the new partnership of Taylor Woolley and Clifford Evans. And it had, prior to that, the statement said that the Miller Woolley Evans firm had broken up. The partnership lasted from 1922 until Woolley retired in 1949. A mid-sized architectural firm, they undertook the design of commercial, residential, and religious buildings. In 1924, one of their residential designs appeared in the June issue of Ladies' Home Journal under the heading Homes Just Big Enough for Two. I haven't been able to find a photograph of that in the library copies of this magazine. And they also designed a Yale Park LDS ward, which you're looking at this is the same building in both photographs. The Yale Park ward was built in 1924, not far from their residences on the East Bench. When I say there, Woolley and Evans. The red brick structure with neoclassical porch, accented keystones of terracotta over tall round arch windows has had several additions to it, some in the back and some to the, I believe, left-hand side. Now, during the Depression, the firm donated the services for the design of a community arts center in Salt Lake City. Some of you are familiar with this place, known as the Art Barn, situated at 54 South Finch Lane in Reservoir Park, next to the tennis courts. Do they still have tennis courts there? Yeah, I thought so. The simple wood frame with colonial motifs and cedar shingle walls and roof was begun in 1931, but not completed until 1933. During the early years of the Depression, funds were hard to come by, slowing its completion. Much of the funding came from the public as well as a large grant from the LDS Church. The building was to function as a place for art exhibitions, as well as music and cultural events, with rooms for meetings, lectures, and gatherings. It opened in 1933 with an art exhibition formed by Taylor Woolley. He had a lot of friends who were artists, and I think those friends ended up in his exhibition. It included a number of his old boyhood chums who became well-established artists in Utah and also on the East Coast. The barn, Art Barn, has been an active venue, and it now houses the Salt Lake City Arts Council, as well as exhibition galleries and space for small events. Before the completion of the art barn was involved in a beautification project for the Utah State Capitol grounds. The firm of Woolley and Evans was chosen, and soon after they drafted plans, an appropriation of $25,000 had already been allocated by state legislature to proceed with the project. In 1933, the project continued under the administration of Governor Henry Blood, and Woolley was appointed as the Capitol architect. Woolley's duties included the Capitol grounds as well as the Capitol building. In the mid-1930s, he supervised the installation of murals painted by noted Utah artists as a part of the art program of the WPA. WPA stands for Work Progress Administration, which is created during the Depression years. The painting was done off-site under the supervision of artist Lee Green Richards, a friend of Taylor Woolley's. The cyclorama for the drum consisted of 8 scenes, the drum under the dome. Consisted of 8 scenes taken from Utah's history, and the paintings on canvas contained over 100 figures, many at least 10 feet in height. These paintings were restored and refreshed during the 2006 restoration of the Capitol. Woolley's position as a Capitol architect did not prevent his firm from accepting architectural commissions. He and Cliff Evans completed a number of commercial, residential, and religious commissions in the 1930s. This included the Garden Park Ward on Yale Avenue in 1938 and dedicated the following year. The building was constructed on a partial foundation of the LeGrand Young estate. The style of the building was described as, quote, predominantly English with an Elizabethan spirit. I'm not sure you can tell that from the photograph. That was what it was called in the dedicatory pamphlet on the building. The style of the building, Red Butte Creek flows behind the building, and it's a beautiful garden back there. This was the ward house, by the way, that both Woolley and Evans families worshipped. Woolley maintained his position as Capitol architect from 1933 until 1941, which was Governor Blood's term of office. The last year proved to be a difficult one for Woolley when his wife Dora passed away at their home from a chronic illness, leaving her husband and their 2 grown children, Nathan and Blossom. Now, I might add that one time I interviewed Nathan, and guess where he was? He was up at the Capitol. He was the Capitol architect. And I thought that was amazing. By the mid to late 40s, Woolley was nearing the end of his career. His last big project brought him back together with 2 close friends, Mahan Young and the painter trying to see my writing here, Waldo Midgley. In 1939, a committee was formed to consider placing a monument to Brigham Young in the mouth of Immigration Canyon, but due to World War II, little of consequence had taken place. Young was getting along in years, and the process of being selected for the monument dedicated to his grandfather was a lengthy one. By 1944, he and Woolley determined where the site would be and how it would be scaled and presented to the public. It was approved, and the project then moved forward. The state acquired the property necessary for the monument, and the site became a state park. 3 years later, on the date of the July 24th, 1947, the centennial date, the saints entered the valley. The monument was completed and dedicated. Woolley and Young would be reunited a little more than 2 years later at a second public ceremony on November 15th, 1949, celebrating the nightly illumination of This Is the Place monument. That year marked Woolley's retirement from the firm, much to the disappointment of his son, Nathan, whose architectural education had been delayed by World War II. Nathan had been a pilot in the Air Force, or I guess in the Army at that time. He passed away at his home in 1965, just 6 years after the death of his mentor, Frank Lloyd Wright. Well remembered by his family, the architectural community, neighbors, and young children who befriended him in his neighborhood of Gilmer Park. His funeral took place in the Woolley and Evans Designed Garden Park Ward, LDS Ward. That's all I have. And do we have time for a few questions? Great.
Pass the microphone around if anyone.
Okay. Don't everyone raise their hand at once.
I've always wondered why, with the kind of training he had with Frank Lloyd Wright, why did his later work really almost abandon that completely?
I don't know. That was around after World War I, and it could be that in competition with other architects that they were moving towards other styles, and that maybe he thought it was time for him to do that. He did design part of Gilmer Park with the curvilinear streets, which that was a change from the square blocks. And so that allowed for a lot of different kinds of designs in various styles in the Gilmer Park area. And I think that was something that was happening all around the country, to tell you the truth. So, anyone else?
So Peter, I'm curious, I can't remember when it was, if it was 1919 or when you said that he decided to come back to Salt Lake because his wife was in poor health and not go do the Imperial Hotel with Wright. What kind of relationship did he have with Wright after that point? Did he ever work with Wright again? Did he stay in contact?
Wright came through Salt Lake City on the way to Taliesin West, and stopped off at his office one time. And that was a later date. And when he did that, Taylor had a cane that supposedly belonged to Brigham Young. And he took his Brigham Young cane and gave it to Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright appeared here a couple of times, but I never read that Woolley was able to see him, and that may have been a health reason or something else. I think he sent he sent maybe Evans to meet with Wright, because Evans also worked at Taliesin East, excuse me. That's what I think. And, you know, Wright was never out of the news. So, I mean, he could learn a lot about Wright by just reading the newspaper or listening to the radio. Any other questions? Oh, come on.
You're in luck, Peter.
Okay, well, I got a question for you. How many Wright houses are there in Utah?
I was just wondering if you could tell us again the name of the LDS church, the first one before the one on Yale Avenue.
Okay, I'll have to dig it out of my paper, but I'll get to that. My question to you is, name the one building that Frank Lloyd Wright did in Utah. Crystalwood? And what was that named after? I mean, who had that?
So there you're gonna have to ask Coral.
I know Coral knows. Yeah, it was I have a last page here somewhere where I've got a couple of bits of information. Well, anyway, I'm trying to think of the family name, which was
Strongquist.
say that again.
Strongquist family.
Like the house.
The Boundwood house.
Stromquist.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it was 1958. Wright died in 1959. The building was built by the Taliesin Associates from his probably from Arizona. And that was finished in, I believe, 63, based on the plan that Wright had already generated. Yeah.
There's a question from Zoom. Go ahead. Oh, we need more of these.
Are Woolies drawings part of the Marriott library collections or
Yes,
are
they are, and they have quite a few. And
Awesome.
some of them, I think, are Wright drawings. He always kept, when he could, blueprints of buildings that he worked on with other architects. And if he was the only one working on the building, you'd see some of the sketches before it went into a final phase. So there's quite a collection up there at the U.
Okay.
The family donated it to the university upon his death.
The other part of the question is, did he continue with the drawing style he learned from, I know you told us how to pronounce this, but it's not Mahoney,
Monty.
Monty,
Money.
and Wright, even as his design style changed. Did he
Didn't catch-
continue with the drawing style he learned from Monty and Wright, even as his design style changed?
The design style would have been probably Prairie School. And Mahoney had left that because she was involved in the capital in Australia and was assisting her husband. She was such a good renderer that she was always used by architects, including Frank Lloyd Wright, that had her working for, if he was working, she was working for someone. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Oh,